My name is Daniel Moore, and if you ask me about my childhood, I'll tell you it was like walking a narrow path between shadows and sunlight. On one side, the coldness of my own parents, and on the other, the rare warmth that kept me alive, the love of my grandparents. I'm 31 now, running a modest private security firm in Austin, Texas. And though my life looks simple on the surface, it's built on lessons carved deep into me by the only people who ever truly cared. I didn't grow up in a poor family. My father, Richard Moore, was a businessman obsessed with prestige. He had a real estate company, always chasing new deals, new investors, new parties where he could boast about his supposed success. My mother, Caroline, was an interior designer, elegant and well-known in social circles, forever preoccupied with the next client or the next showy event. They married young, built a reputation quickly, and then lost themselves in the whirlpool of ambition. My brother Adam, older by 3 years, embraced that world early. He loved being the favorite, buying flashy clothes, bragging about grades, and constantly reminding everyone that he was Dad's golden boy. Me? I was the quiet one, the overlooked one. I preferred to sit with books or run out into the fields, pretending the world was larger than the suffocating house we lived in. But no matter how much I longed for attention, my parents had little to give. Nights were spent in front of the TV waiting for their return. Sometimes Dad stumbled in, drunk, talking about investments. Sometimes Mom came home with eyes red from exhaustion, forcing a smile as she whispered, "I'm building a future for you boys." But her future didn't include listening to me talk about my day or hugging me when I had nightmares. Adam never seemed to mind. He chased their approval like a moth after flame. But me, I needed warmth, real warmth, and I found it at my grandparents' ranch. My grandfather, Henry Moore, was a tall man with a calm, commanding presence. White hair, sharp eyes, and a voice that could silence an entire room without effort. My grandmother, Evelyn, was his opposite in the gentlest way, always smiling, always baking something that filled the house with the smell of home. Together, they had built a transportation company called Silverline Logistics. What started decades ago with a single truck had grown into a massive operation stretching across states, employing hundreds. But they never flaunted their success. They lived on their ranch, in a house filled not with gold, but with memories. Their values were simple: integrity, responsibility, compassion. "Money is just a tool, Daniel," Grandpa would tell me. "Never let it own you. Build trust, not greed." The first time I truly felt like I belonged was one sweltering summer afternoon. I was 8, and my parents were in the middle of another fight about money. Adam had locked himself in his room, but I couldn't stand the shouting anymore. I grabbed my bike and pedaled as fast as I could to the ranch. When I arrived, tears streaking my face, Grandpa was repairing an old tractor. He handed me a wrench without a word and said, "Work clears the mind, son." We worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, and that night Grandma served us her homemade barbecue. For the first time, I felt safe. From that day forward, the ranch became my refuge. I spent weekends there, summers too. Grandpa taught me to drive trucks, fix engines, and manage warehouses. Grandma taught me kindness, patience, and the art of listening. While my parents drowned in debt and ambition, my grandparents built me into someone stronger. When I joined the military after high school, it was their letters that kept me steady. Week after week, Grandpa's firm handwriting and Grandma's soft encouragement reminded me I wasn't alone. And when I came back, broken but determined, they stood by me as I built my security business from the ground up. Grandpa even became one of my first clients, hiring my company to protect Silverline warehouses, not out of pity, but trust. But all that stability, all that guidance was ripped away in a single phone call. One morning, while I was reviewing contracts, my father's voice came through the line, trembling, not with grief but something sharper. "Daniel, your grandparents, their plane, it went down, they're gone." The world blurred, my knees nearly buckled. I dropped everything and drove to the ranch, my mind racing with memories. Grandpa's steady hands on the steering wheel teaching me how to drive, Grandma's pies cooling on the windowsill. But when I arrived, the house wasn't a home anymore. It was swarming with people, whispers and faces that weren't mourning, but calculating. My parents, my brother, even my uncle who had flown in from overseas, they weren't grieving the loss. They were circling like vultures over a fortune they believed was finally theirs. And I, though I didn't know it then, was about to become the center of a storm that would tear my family apart forever. The funeral came too quickly, as though fate wanted to test how strong I truly was. It was held at a small church near the ranch, just the way my grandparents had wished. Simple, heartfelt, surrounded by neighbors, employees, and friends who had known them not as wealthy business owners, but as kind souls who never hesitated to help. People lined up to share stories. A farmer whose loan Grandpa had quietly paid off, a young woman Grandma had supported through college, employees who said their jobs had saved their families. Every word made my chest tighten, because I knew these weren't just empty tales. They were proof of the lives my grandparents had touched. I stood near their coffins, my fists clenched, trying to hold back tears. To me, they were more than grandparents. They were the parents I should have had. Without them, I wasn't sure who I would become. Adam stood beside me, but instead of grief, his eyes darted constantly, cold and calculating, like he was already measuring what would soon be his. My father, Richard, gave a eulogy that sounded rehearsed, filled with words like legacy and inheritance, rather than love and loss. My mother, Caroline, wept loudly, but even in her tears, she whispered questions to people about the company, about assets, about numbers. Then there was my uncle Stephen, my father's younger brother, who had been living in London for years. He had barely visited when my grandparents were alive, but he flew back immediately after their deaths. His embrace at the airport was stiff, and though he muttered, "It's terrible, Daniel, we have to stay united," his eyes betrayed him. Cold, greedy, already probing. He hadn't come for closure, he'd come for the empire. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. A week after the funeral, I was summoned, along with my family, to the office of my grandparents' lawyer, Mr. Harris. His office was old-fashioned, filled with stacks of papers and the scent of aged leather. He had been a close friend of my grandfather for decades. As we sat around the large wooden table, my parents on one side, Adam and Uncle Stephen on the other, I felt my heart pounding, not out of anticipation of riches, but out of fear that my grandparents' wishes would be twisted, ignored, or stolen. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses, opened a sealed envelope, and cleared his throat. His voice was steady as he read, "This is the last will and testament of Henry and Evelyn Moore, updated 6 months prior to their passing." He paused, looking at each of us before continuing. "We, Henry and Evelyn Moore, leave our entire estate, including all properties, cash, and shares in Silverline Logistics, valued at over $40 million, to our grandson, Daniel Moore." The silence that followed was suffocating. My ears rang. My heart stopped. I couldn't even process the words at first. $40 million? The entire estate? Me? It felt impossible. I had never once thought of money when it came to them. Their love had been enough. Then the storm broke. My father shot out of his chair, his face crimson. "What? This is ridiculous. Daniel manipulated them. There's no way my own parents would cut me out." He pointed at me like I was some kind of criminal. My mother's tears turned into shrieks. "Son, what did you do? How could you steal this from your family?" Adam's glare burned into me, filled with hatred and jealousy. "So this is why you spent so much time with them, huh? To worm your way into their will?" Uncle Stephen leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with venom. "This must be a mistake. We need to review this again. No court will uphold such nonsense." I sat frozen, my chest heaving, my hands trembling on the table. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't asked for this. I loved them because they were my grandparents, not because of their wealth. I wanted to scream, but before I could, Mr. Harris raised his hand. "Please, there's more." He pressed a button on a small remote and a projector flickered on. My breath caught as I saw the faces of my grandparents appear on the screen. They were sitting together, smiling softly, but their voices were steady, firm. Grandpa spoke first. "If you're watching this, it means we're gone. And if you're shocked, it's because we've made a decision that might not please all of you." He glanced at Grandma, who nodded gently. "We love all of our children and grandchildren, but we've seen who carries our values. Daniel has lived with integrity, hard work, and independence. He never came to us with his hands out, never tried to manipulate us for money. Richard, Caroline, Adam, Stephen, you've all borrowed, promised, and failed to return. You've chosen greed over family. That broke our hearts." Grandma's eyes glistened as she added, "We trust Daniel to carry this legacy forward, to protect it, not waste it, to use it for good, for people, not for selfish gain. Please respect this decision. It is our final word." When the video ended, the room erupted in chaos. My father slammed his fist on the table. They were manipulated. They weren't in their right minds. My mother sobbed, "Daniel, you can't do this to us. You have to share. We're your family." Adam lunged toward me, hissing, "Sign it over, right now. I'll give you a share. Don't be stupid." Uncle Stephen's voice was low, dangerous. "Think carefully, Daniel. If you don't cooperate, we'll ruin you. We'll drag this through every court until you're destroyed." I stood, my legs weak, my voice trembling but resolute. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't manipulate anyone. They made their choice. I'm going to honor it." The hatred in their eyes was immediate, sharp, and undeniable. My own blood, looking at me as if I were the enemy. My father pointed a finger at me, his voice a growl. "You'll regret this, Daniel. I'll sue, and I'll make sure everyone knows you're a fraud." Adam sneered, "You're nothing without us. I'll tell the world you tricked them." Uncle Stephen smiled coldly. "You don't know what you're stepping into. You'll wish you'd given in." I left that office with my world turned upside down. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from them. Threats, demands, insults. "You're dead to me," Adam texted. "Think again, son, or don't blame me for being ruthless," my father warned. But through the storm, I remembered my grandparents' voices, their words in that final message. "We trust Daniel." I drove to the ranch that night, walked into the quiet house that was now mine, and knelt at their graves in the backyard. "I'll protect it," I whispered through tears. "I'll protect everything you built, I promise." But deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. My family wasn't going to let go. They would fight, and I would have to fight back. Not with fists, but with truth, strength, and the very values my grandparents had entrusted me with. And so the battle for their legacy truly began. The days following the reading of the will were some of the longest and most suffocating of my life. On the surface, the ranch was quiet. Sunlight poured across the fields, the cattle grazed lazily, and the wind rustled through the old oak trees that my grandparents had planted decades ago. But inside the house, I could feel the storm brewing. My phone never stopped buzzing. Calls, messages, emails, from my parents, from Adam, from Uncle Stephen, each one more aggressive than the last. At first, they tried persuasion. My mother's voice cracked through the phone late at night. "Daniel, sweetheart, you can't carry this burden alone. Just transfer part of it to your father. Think of the family. Think of Adam. We'll help you manage it." I almost wanted to believe her, almost wanted to think she meant it. But then I remembered the way she looked at me in the lawyer's office, not with love, but with hunger. Then came the threats. Adam's texts grew darker. "You think you're safe? Everyone's going to know what you did. I'll make sure you lose everything." My father's voice boomed through voicemails. "You're still my son, Daniel, but if you don't hand this over, I'll drag you through court until you beg me to stop." Uncle Stephen was more polished, sending long, cold emails filled with legal jargon and promises of endless lawsuits if I didn't come to my senses. I tried to ignore them, but I couldn't shake the unease. The weight of $40 million wasn't just money. It was responsibility. It was danger. And I couldn't help but wonder, had my grandparents known this would happen? Had they prepared for the storm? My answer came one evening when I found Samuel, the old housekeeper who had worked for my grandparents for over 30 years, waiting for me on the porch. He was in his early 60s, tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much but still held kindness. He had practically raised me during those summers at the ranch, quietly keeping the household together while my grandparents focused on the business. "Mr. Daniel," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades, "they told me this day would come." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He gestured for me to follow him inside. We walked to my grandfather's old study, a room filled with dusty bookshelves, ledgers, and the faint smell of tobacco from the pipe he used to smoke. Samuel went to a heavy safe in the corner, entered a code, and pulled out a thick stack of folders and a small black box. He laid them on the desk in front of me. "Your grandparents weren't naive," Samuel explained, his voice steady. "They knew their children too well. They knew greed would consume them. They knew that when they were gone, there would be war over what they left behind. So they planned for it. I opened the folders, my hands shaking. Inside were copies of legal documents, medical evaluations, financial reports, all meticulously prepared. There were letters from doctors certifying my grandparents' mental competence, dated just months before their deaths. There were contracts outlining an asset protection trust that had been set up years earlier. This, Samuel said, tapping the papers, is their shield for you. They placed most of their assets, including the ranch, the warehouses, and company shares, into a trust with you as the sole beneficiary. But it's not just a free-for-all. You can't sell off the land or drain the money. The trust has strict rules. It must be used for maintaining Silverline Logistics, supporting the community, and continuing their charitable work. That way, even if your family pressures you, you have the law on your side. You can tell them it's not yours to give away. My breath caught in my throat as I realized how far ahead they had thought. It wasn't just about leaving me wealth. It was about protecting me from the very people who should have been my family. Samuel then opened the black box. Inside was a flash drive, a small leather-bound diary, and several DVDs. They wanted you to have this if things got ugly, he said quietly. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop, and my stomach twisted as I read the files. Emails from my father begging Grandpa for money to cover urgent business expenses that turned out to be luxury purchases. Messages from Adam demanding thousands for a new car or expensive trips. Uncle Stephen's correspondence from London, thinly veiled inquiries about company shares and inheritance, always framed as if he were entitled. The diary was even worse. My grandfather's handwriting, sharp and heavy, chronicled every disappointment. Richard borrowed again, promising to repay. He never did. Adam has turned into a mirror of his father, arrogant, reckless, ungrateful. Stephen called tonight, asking again about the company's future. I can see the greed in his tone. Grandma's entries were softer but heartbreaking. I love my children, but they only see us as a wallet. Only Daniel visits just to talk, just to be here. He doesn't ask for anything. That's why I believe in him. Tears blurred my vision as I flipped through the pages. The DVDs contained video clips, footage from security cameras in the house. One showed my father shouting at Grandpa, calling him stingy for refusing another loan. Another caught Adam rummaging through drawers, taking valuables. Another revealed Uncle Stephen on one of his rare visits, whispering with my father about dividing the estate once my grandparents were gone. It was damning. It was undeniable. And it was mine to use if things escalated. I leaned back in the chair, my heart heavy, my mind spinning. My grandparents hadn't just trusted me with their legacy. They had armed me with everything I needed to defend it. They had seen this war coming years before I did. Samuel placed a hand on my shoulder. They believed in you, Daniel. They knew you'd be strong enough. But you must be careful. This is more than money. It's power. And power makes people desperate. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the study, staring at the documents, listening to the silence of the ranch. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but inside, all I could hear were my grandparents' voices from that video. We trust Daniel. I whispered into the darkness, I won't let you down. But even as I spoke the words, I knew the fight was far from over. My family wasn't going to stop. They were going to come for me, for the legacy, for everything my grandparents had built. And when they did, I'd have to be ready, not just to protect myself, but to protect the very values my grandparents had lived by. Because this was no longer just an inheritance. It was a battlefield. The first real confrontation came sooner than I expected. Barely 2 weeks after the funeral, I was at the ranch reviewing security reports from my own company when I saw the familiar headlights pulling up to the front gate. My heart sank. On the cameras, I watched as my father, mother, Adam, and Uncle Stephen stepped out of their cars. Their faces weren't grief-stricken or even solemn. They looked determined, aggressive, like predators circling prey. I called down to Mike, my old military comrade who now managed security for me. Double the guard at the gate. No one gets in unless I say so. He replied instantly, Roger that, boss. I switched between camera feeds on my phone, watching them pound on the iron gate, shouting. My father's voice bellowed through the speakers. Daniel, stop hiding like a coward and come out here. We need to settle this." Adam slammed his fist against the gate. "Open it, or I'll climb over." My mother's sobs cut through the noise. "Please, Daniel, talk to us. We're family. We can't live like this." And then Uncle Stephen, his voice calm but sharp, spoke up. "You know this isn't sustainable, Daniel. You can't stand against us all. Open the gate and let's deal with this like civilized people." My chest tightened. For a brief moment, I wanted to keep the gate closed, to let them scream outside until they gave up. But then I remembered my grandfather's words, written in that diary. If there's a dispute, face it head on. Don't avoid it, because avoidance only gives the greedy more room to grow. I pressed the button. The gate creaked open. They stormed into the house like a gust of wind, pushing past Samuel, who stood at the porch, his arms crossed, his face lined with quiet disapproval. I was waiting in the living room, standing tall, though my hands trembled slightly behind my back. My father wasted no time. "This ends today. That will is forged. Harris is in your pocket. You've stolen what belongs to this family." His finger jabbed the air toward me like a weapon. I took a deep breath. "It wasn't forged. You saw the video. Grandpa and Grandma were clear." Adam sneered, pacing like a caged animal. "They were old, senile. You poisoned their minds. Everyone knows you were their favorite. You manipulated them for years." Uncle Stephen folded his arms, his voice calm but dripping with disdain. "Daniel, you're young, naive. This estate is too much for you. If you're smart, you'll transfer control to us. We'll manage it properly and you'll get your fair share." My mother cried harder, stepping toward me. "Son, please, think of your father, think of your brother. We're drowning in debt. Do you want to see us ruined? You have the power to save us. Don't be so stubborn." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. My grandparents hadn't just left me assets, they'd left me a mission and proof of the truth. "I'll talk," I said, "but not in private. We'll do this openly with witnesses." At that moment, the back door opened, and in came the people I had called earlier that day. Mr. Harris, the lawyer, carrying a thick briefcase of documents. Judge Harold, a retired judge and old friend of my grandfather. Sheriff Ramirez with 2 deputies, his presence a quiet but powerful warning. 2 longtime employees from Silverline Logistics who had seen my father's borrowing firsthand. And finally, a reporter from the Dallas Morning News, recorder in hand. My family froze, their faces twisting with shock. My father's voice cracked with rage. "What the hell is this? You brought outsiders into our business?" Adam snarled. "You called the press? Are you insane?" I stood firm, my voice steadier than I felt. "No more secrets. No more manipulation. This ends today." Mr. Harris opened the briefcase, pulling out documents. "The will is legally sound. The trust is ironclad. Medical evaluations confirm Henry and Evelyn Moore were fully competent. Any challenge on grounds of manipulation or senility will fail." Judge Harold nodded. "I've reviewed it all. The law is clear. Daniel is the rightful heir, and the trust prevents reckless use of assets. There's no loophole here." I didn't stop there. I pulled out my laptop, connecting it to the big screen in the living room. But it's not just about legality. It's about truth. I played the first video, my father, 2 years ago, screaming at Grandpa in the study. "You're stingy, old man. I'm your son, and you won't even give me what I deserve?" My father's face went pale as the room filled with his own voice. "That's private," he barked. The next video, Adam rifling through Grandma's drawers, pocketing jewelry. He shouted, "That's a lie!" But the image on the screen left no room for denial. Then came a recording of a phone call, Uncle Stephen telling my father, "When they're gone, we'll divide the assets evenly. Daniel doesn't need to know." His calm composure cracked, his face flushing as whispers filled the room. Finally, I read aloud from Grandpa's diary. His words were heavy, damning. "Richard borrows again, no repayment. Adam demands without gratitude. Stephen circles like a vulture. Only Daniel comes with nothing in his hands but honesty." The silence that followed was crushing. The only sound was the reporter's pen scratching across paper. My father's rage boiled over. "This is a setup. You planned this." Adam lunged toward me, but the deputy stepped forward, blocking him. Uncle Stephen tried to recover his composure, sneering. "This won't last, Daniel. You can't run a company. You'll collapse under the weight, and when you do, we'll be there to pick up the pieces." I stared at them, my hands shaking but my voice clear. "I won't collapse, because unlike you, I don't see this as money. It's a legacy, and I'll protect it with everything I have. My father's eyes burned into me. You're no son of mine anymore. He stormed out, my mother trailing behind him, sobbing. Adam cursed under his breath, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. Uncle Stephen paused, gave me a cold, calculated look, and muttered, "This isn't over." Then he too walked out. The room emptied, leaving behind only the witnesses, the sheriff, and Mr. Harris. My knees nearly gave out, and I dropped into a chair, my chest heaving. Samuel placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice low. "They showed you their true selves tonight, Mr. Daniel. Don't forget it." The reporter closed her notebook and whispered, "The truth will be your shield, but it will also make you a target." That night, I barely slept. I paced the house, checking the security feeds again and again, half expecting to see them returning in anger. My phone buzzed nonstop, more threats, more curses, even rumors spreading online as Adam began smearing my name. But through the exhaustion and fear, I held on to one thought. My grandparents had trusted me. They had armed me. And no matter what storm my family brought, I wasn't going to betray that trust. What I didn't know then was that this was just the opening battle. The real war for the legacy was only beginning. The morning after that confrontation, the ranch felt heavier than ever before. The air outside was crisp, the sky stretched wide and blue over the Texas fields, but inside me there was only turbulence. I wandered through the halls of the house, Grandpa's study with its towering bookshelves, Grandma's kitchen still faintly smelling of cinnamon, the living room where we had shared countless warm evenings. Yet everything felt different now. This wasn't just a home anymore. It was a fortress, and I was its defender. I sat at the old oak desk in the study, staring at the piles of evidence Samuel had laid out the night before. The diary entries, the recordings, the financial reports. They weren't just reminders of my family's greed, they were weapons. My grandparents hadn't left me unprotected. They had anticipated every move my father Adam and Uncle Stephen might make. And now, the responsibility of wielding these weapons fell squarely on me. The first call came mid-morning. It was Adam, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you humiliated us last night? You think you can parade us in front of judges and lawyers and walk away clean? This isn't over, Daniel. I'll make sure you regret every second of it. I'll destroy you online, in court, everywhere." He hung up before I could answer. Minutes later, my father's voice filled my voicemail. "You betrayed your family. You're siding with outsiders, dragging our name through the mud. Fine, you've made your choice. You're no son of mine. From this moment on, we're enemies." My mother tried last, her tone softer, pleading, "Daniel, please, don't let them push us apart. You know your father. They're just angry. But you can fix this. Just give them something, a piece of it, anything. Don't let this family break apart." Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I can't lose all of you." I clenched my jaw and turned off the phone. My heart ached, but I couldn't give in. I could see their pattern now, sweet words to lure me in, threats when I refused, back and forth until I cracked. But I wouldn't crack, not when I could still hear Grandpa's voice echoing in my mind. Money doesn't build family. Character does. Later that afternoon, Samuel came into the study carrying another stack of documents. His expression was grim. "There's something else you need to see, Mr. Daniel." He spread the papers across the desk. Contracts, loan agreements, repayment schedules, evidence of years of my father's borrowing from Silverline Logistics, most of it never repaid. "Your grandfather documented everything," Samuel explained. "Every dollar Richard borrowed, every promise broken. These records are airtight. If they try to claim entitlement to the company, this will bury them." I ran my hand over the papers, feeling the weight of each signature, each broken promise. My father had seen the company not as a legacy, but as a piggy bank. Adam had followed in his footsteps, demanding money without gratitude. Uncle Stephen, from across the ocean, had circled like a vulture, waiting for the day he could swoop in. And now they were united against me. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I realized I couldn't fight this war reactively. I couldn't just wait for them to strike and then defend myself. I had to go on the offensive. The next morning I called Mr. Harris. "We need to prepare for lawsuits," I said firmly. "I want everything documented. Every loan, every broken promise, every piece of evidence my grandparents left." He nodded. "Good. Because I've already heard whispers. Your father and Stephen are contacting firms in Dallas, looking for lawyers willing to take the case. They'll try to paint you as manipulative, greedy, unstable. We have to stay ahead of them. I also called Sheriff Ramirez. If they try anything on the ranch, trespassing, theft, harassment, I want it on record immediately. The sheriff's voice was steady. You have my word, Daniel. I knew your grandparents. They were good people. I'll make sure their wishes are respected. But the most important call I made was to my own security team. I want the ranch locked down tighter than Fort Knox. Cameras, sensors, guards at every entrance. If they think they can intimidate me here, they're dead wrong. Mike chuckled over the line, his voice carrying the familiar steadiness of an old comrade. Roger that, boss. We'll treat it like a battlefield perimeter. Nobody gets through without your say-so. By evening, the ranch was humming with activity. Cameras blinked red from every corner, motion sensors lined the fences, and guards patrolled the grounds in pairs. It felt strange, turning my childhood refuge into a military outpost, but it also felt necessary. Samuel watched from the porch, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of the security lights. Your grandparents would be proud, he said quietly. They wanted you to be strong, to protect this place. They knew this day would come. I stared out at the fields, at the graves of Henry and Evelyn Moore resting peacefully under the oak tree. I just wish it didn't have to be against my own family, I whispered. Samuel sighed, his eyes heavy with wisdom. Blood is not always family, Mr. Daniel. Family is who protects you, who stands by you. Your grandparents understood that. Now you must, too. That night, I lay in my grandfather's bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The house creaked with the sounds of guards outside, the faint hum of cameras, the distant rustle of wind through the fields. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Adam. You're finished. Just wait. I turned the phone face down, my fists clenched. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of him. I wasn't afraid of any of them. Because now, I wasn't just Daniel Moore, the overlooked son. I was the heir to a legacy, the defender of a fortress, the last line standing between greed and honor. And though the war had only just begun, I knew one thing for certain. I was ready. What I didn't yet know was how far they were willing to go, or how much darker the coming battles would be. The first lawsuit came less than a month later. I had been expecting it, of course. My father was too proud, too angry, too desperate to simply let the matter go. But even though I knew it was coming, when the official envelope arrived at the ranch, stamped with bold legal markings, my stomach still dropped. I sat in the study, the late afternoon sunlight spilling across the desk as I slid it open with a trembling hand. Inside was the declaration. Richard Moore versus Daniel Moore. My own father suing me. The words felt surreal, like they couldn't possibly belong to my life. He was claiming that the will had been manipulated, that I had influenced my grandparents while they were in a weakened state, and that I had taken advantage of their diminished capacity. He demanded that the court nullify the inheritance and divide the estate equally among the rightful heirs. I read it again and again, each time feeling as though knives were pressing deeper into my chest. My father wasn't just challenging me, he was accusing me of betraying the two people I loved most in the world. I called Mr. Harris immediately. It's here, I said, my voice low but steady. The papers. I expected as much, he replied calmly. Don't panic, Daniel. We have everything we need. The medical evaluations, the trust, the videos, they prepared for this exact attack. It won't hold up in court. But it's not just about the court, is it? I muttered. It's about the headlines, the whispers, the rumors. Harris sighed. Yes, your father and brother are already pushing stories to the press. They're trying to paint you as a greedy opportunist. You'll have to decide soon whether you want to fight quietly in court or publicly in the open. That night, I barely touched my dinner. Samuel watched me from across the table, his weathered hands folded neatly, his eyes sharp with understanding. They're going to drag you through the mud, Mr. Daniel, he said softly. But mud doesn't stick when you stand in the truth. I wanted to believe him. But as the days passed, I saw the storm gathering. Adam launched an online campaign, posting cryptic messages on social media. Money changes people. Funny how some heirs suddenly pretend to be saints. Not everything is as it seems. His friends, his followers, even strangers picked up the threads, weaving a narrative where I was the villain. Comments poured in, some sympathetic, but many scathing, accusing me of exploiting my grandparents' love, of betraying my parents. Uncle Stephen, from across the Atlantic, gave an interview to a London business magazine. His words were carefully chosen but cutting. It's tragic, really. My brother and I worked alongside our parents for decades, yet somehow, a single grandchild ends up with everything. One has to wonder how such decisions are made. The narrative was clear. I was the usurper, the manipulator, the one who didn't deserve the legacy. But I wasn't going to let them win. 2 weeks later, I called Mr. Harris, Judge Harold, and Sheriff Ramirez to the ranch. I also invited 2 local journalists, one from Dallas, one from Austin. If my family wanted to make this public, then public it would be. We gathered in the living room, the same place where my family had once erupted in fury. This time, I was ready. Cameras blinked red from the corners, capturing everything. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging in my chest. "You've all heard the accusations, that I manipulated my grandparents, that they weren't in their right minds. Today, I want to show you the truth." I opened the thick folder of medical reports, laying them on the table for the journalists to photograph. 3 independent doctors certified that Henry and Evelyn Moore were fully competent, even months before they updated the will. Their signatures are here, their evaluations undeniable. Next, I turned on the projector and played the video of my grandparents. Their voices filled the room once again. "We trust Daniel. He lived by the values we taught: integrity, independence, compassion. He cared for us without asking for anything in return." I saw the journalists scribble furiously, their eyes wide. Then I opened the diary. My grandfather's words spilled into the room. "Richard borrows again, promising to repay. Adam demands money for luxuries. Stephen calls only to ask about assets. Only Daniel comes to sit with us, to help, to listen." The silence was thick. Even Sheriff Ramirez, usually unflinching, shook his head slowly. Finally, I held up the trust documents. "This isn't about greed. It isn't even about me. The estate is in a trust that cannot be used recklessly. It is for maintaining Silverline logistics, for supporting the community, for charity. I can't sell it, I can't squander it, I can't hand it over. My grandparents designed it this way because they knew what was coming." The journalists asked questions, their pens flying. Harris added details. Judge Harold vouched for the documents, and Samuel stood quietly at my side, nodding. When the session ended, I knew I had struck back. The next day, headlines shifted. Grandson produces evidence of parents' greed. Inheritance battle exposes family rift. Online, the tide began to turn. People shared the video of my grandparents, their words piercing through the noise. Sympathy for me grew, and with it, outrage at my father and brother. But victory was fleeting. That night, as I walked the perimeter of the ranch with Mike, checking the motion sensors, a chill ran down my spine. For the first time since returning to the ranch, I felt like I was being watched. The shadows along the fence line seemed too deep, too still. Mike noticed it too. "We're not alone tonight," he muttered, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. The next morning, I found footprints near the back fence. Fresh, heavy, leading toward the ranch before veering off into the fields. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. I knew then that the war wasn't just in the courts or the headlines. My family wasn't going to stop at words. They were going to push further, deeper, until they either broke me or forced me to fight with everything I had. And I was ready. Because this wasn't just about defending money. This was about defending my grandparents' legacy, their memory, their love. And I swore to myself, as I stood on that field staring at the tracks in the dirt, that I wouldn't let anyone, family or not, take that away. The first lawsuit came less than a month later. I had been expecting it, of course. My father was too proud, too angry, too desperate to simply let the matter go. But even though I knew it was coming, when the official envelope arrived at the ranch, stamped with bold legal markings, my stomach still dropped. I sat in the study, the late afternoon sunlight spilling across the desk as I slid it open with a trembling hand. Inside was the declaration: Richard Moore versus Daniel Moore. My own father suing me. The words felt surreal, like they couldn't possibly belong to my life. He was claiming that the will had been manipulated, that I had influenced my grandparents while they were in a weakened state, and that I had taken advantage of their diminished capacity. He demanded that the court nullify the inheritance and divide the estate equally among the rightful heirs. I read it again and again, each time feeling as though knives were pressing deeper into my chest. My father wasn't just challenging me, he was accusing me of betraying the two people I loved most in the world. I called Mr. Harris immediately. "It's here," I said, my voice low but steady. "The papers." "I expected as much," he replied calmly. "Don't panic, Daniel. We have everything we need. The medical evaluations, the trust, the videos, they prepared for this exact attack. It won't hold up in court." "But it's not just about the court, is it?" I muttered. "It's about the headlines, the whispers, the rumors." Harris sighed. "Yes, your father and brother are already pushing stories to the press. They're trying to paint you as a greedy opportunist. You'll have to decide soon whether you want to fight quietly in court or publicly in the open." That night, I barely touched my dinner. Samuel watched me from across the table, his weathered hands folded neatly, his eyes sharp with understanding. "They're going to drag you through the mud, Mr. Daniel," he said softly. "But mud doesn't stick when you stand in the truth." I wanted to believe him. But as the days passed, I saw the storm gathering. Adam launched an online campaign, posting cryptic messages on social media. Money changes people. Funny how some heirs suddenly pretend to be saints. Not everything is as it seems. His friends, his followers, even strangers picked up the threads, weaving a narrative where I was the villain. Comments poured in, some sympathetic, but many scathing, accusing me of exploiting my grandparents' love, of betraying my parents. Uncle Stephen from across the Atlantic gave an interview to a London business magazine. His words were carefully chosen but cutting. It's tragic, really. My brother and I worked alongside our parents for decades, yet somehow a single grandchild ends up with everything. One has to wonder how such decisions are made. The narrative was clear. I was the usurper, the manipulator, the one who didn't deserve the legacy, but I wasn't going to let them win. 2 weeks later, I called Mr. Harris, Judge Harold, and Sheriff Ramirez to the ranch. I also invited 2 local journalists, one from Dallas, one from Austin. If my family wanted to make this public, then public it would be. We gathered in the living room, the same place where my family had once erupted in fury. This time, I was ready. Cameras blinked red from the corners, capturing everything. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging in my chest. "You've all heard the accusations, that I manipulated my grandparents, that they weren't in their right minds. Today, I want to show you the truth." I opened the thick folder of medical reports, laying them on the table for the journalists to photograph. 3 independent doctors certified that Henry and Evelyn Moore were fully competent, even months before they updated the will. Their signatures are here, their evaluations undeniable. Next, I turned on the projector and played the video of my grandparents. Their voices filled the room once again. "We trust Daniel. He lived by the values we taught: integrity, independence, compassion. He cared for us without asking for anything in return." I saw the journalists scribble furiously, their eyes wide. Then I opened the diary. My grandfather's words spilled into the room. "Richard borrows again, promising to repay. Adam demands money for luxuries. Stephen calls only to ask about assets. Only Daniel comes to sit with us, to help, to listen." The silence was thick. Even Sheriff Ramirez, usually unflinching, shook his head slowly. Finally, I held up the trust documents. "This isn't about greed. It isn't even about me. The estate is in a trust that cannot be used recklessly. It is for maintaining Silverline Logistics, for supporting the community, for charity. I can't sell it. I can't squander it. I can't hand it over. My grandparents designed it this way because they knew what was coming." The journalists asked questions, their pens flying. Harris added details, Judge Harold vouched for the documents, and Samuel stood quietly at my side, nodding. When the session ended, I knew I had struck back. The next day, headlines shifted. Grandson produces evidence of parents' greed. Inheritance battle exposes family rift. Online, the tide began to turn. People shared the video of my grandparents, their words piercing through the noise. Sympathy for me grew, and with it, outrage at my father and brother. But victory was fleeting. That night, as I walked the perimeter of the ranch with Mike, checking the motion sensors, A chill ran down my spine. For the first time since returning to the ranch, I felt like I was being watched. The shadows along the fence line seemed too deep, too still. Mike noticed it too. "We're not alone tonight," he muttered, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. The next morning, I found footprints near the back fence, fresh, heavy, leading toward the ranch before veering off into the fields. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. I knew then that the war wasn't just in the courts or the headlines. My family wasn't going to stop at words. They were going to push further, deeper, until they either broke me or forced me to fight with everything I had. And I was ready. Because this wasn't just about defending money. This was about defending my grandparents' legacy, their memory, their love. And I swore to myself, as I stood on that field staring at the tracks in the dirt, that I wouldn't let anyone, family or not, take that away. The break-in attempt changed everything. Until that moment, I had believed my family's attacks would remain confined to the courtroom and the headlines. But when I saw the footage of masked figures cutting through my fence, the crowbar abandoned in the grass, the spray can filled with red paint, I realized I had underestimated them. This was no longer just a matter of lawyers and words. It was turning into something physical, dangerous. The following morning, I sat in the study with Mike and Samuel. Harris joined us through a video call, his face stern behind thick glasses. The four of us formed what I began to think of as my war council. "This won't be the last attempt," Mike said flatly. His years in the military had given him the ability to read patterns. "They tested your perimeter last night. Next time, they'll come better prepared. We need to assume escalation." Samuel rubbed his forehead. "It breaks my heart to say it, but he's right. Your father, Adam, even Stephen, they're not thinking rationally. They're blinded by greed, and blind men are the most dangerous." Harris leaned closer to the camera. "Daniel, you must understand something. The court case is only one front. They'll use fear, intimidation, public defamation, anything they can. We need to prepare legal responses, yes, but also personal defenses. I suggest filing restraining orders immediately." I nodded slowly, my chest heavy. "Do it. File them all. I don't care how much paperwork it takes." That afternoon, I walked the ranch grounds myself, inspecting every sensor, every gate, every camera. The men nodded as I passed, their boots crunching in the dirt, rifles slung across their backs. It felt surreal. This wasn't the military. It wasn't some foreign battlefield. This was my home, my grandparents' sanctuary, turned into a fortress because of my own flesh and blood. When I reached the oak tree where Henry and Evelyn Moore rested, I stopped, staring at the carved names. "I hope I'm doing this right," I whispered. "You taught me to fight for what matters. I just never thought the enemy would be family." The days that followed were a blur of battles on multiple fronts. In court, Harris shredded every accusation they made. The medical evaluations stood unshaken. The trust documents held like steel. Judges frowned at my father's sloppy evidence, at Stephen's vague accusations from across the ocean. On the legal front, I was winning, but outside the courtroom, it was chaos. Adam doubled down on social media, posting photos of himself and my parents looking miserable in their foreclosed house, with captions like, "Meanwhile, my brother sits on $40 million and lets his family starve." The posts went viral, drawing sympathy from strangers who knew nothing of the truth. I woke up to hundreds of messages, some hateful, some pleading, some accusing me of being a monster. Uncle Stephen used his connections in England to publish articles painting me as a reckless veteran, unfit to manage a fortune. He used words like unstable, aggressive, and manipulative. He never mentioned his own emails to my grandparents begging for shares. Even my mother joined the chorus, though in a softer way. She gave interviews where she wept openly, saying, "I just want my family back. I don't care about money. I only want Daniel to forgive us." But I knew better. I had the footage of her leaving the funeral with Grandma's pearl necklace tucked in her purse. For every lie they spread, I responded with truth. I held another press conference at the ranch, this time inviting employees of Silverline Logistics to speak. One by one, they testified how my grandparents had supported them through hardships and how my father had borrowed from the company's funds for personal gain. A manager named Linda stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. Mr. Henry always said Daniel was the only one who understood responsibility. We trust him, just as they did. The press ate it up. For every smear, I had evidence. For every rumor, I had testimony. Slowly, the narrative began to shift again, but my family was growing desperate. Late one night, as I reviewed security footage, an alert flashed across my screen. Movement near the barn. My pulse quickened. Mike and I rushed out, rifles at the ready, floodlights illuminating the yard. And there he was, Adam. He wasn't masked this time. He stood there, drunk, swaying, his fists clenched. "You think you're better than me, Daniel?" he slurred, shouting into the night. "You think you deserve all this?" "Adam, go home," I warned, my voice steady though my hands shook. "This is mine," he screamed, kicking at the barn door. "Dad built this family. You're nothing but a thief." The deputies arrived within minutes, sirens wailing as they pulled into the yard. Adam resisted, cursing, spitting, until they forced him into the back of the car. I watched from the porch, my chest aching. This was my brother, the boy I had once played with in these fields, now reduced to a desperate intruder. The sheriff's words were grim. "He's out of control, Daniel. Next time, it could be worse." I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. By morning, Harris had already filed new charges: trespassing, attempted property damage, violation of the restraining order. Adam would face real consequences now. But instead of relief, I felt only sorrow. I didn't want him jailed. I didn't want any of this. As I sat in Grandma's old rocking chair, Samuel entered quietly. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You can't save them, Mr. Daniel. Your grandparents tried. They gave them chance after chance, and still they chose greed. You must accept that." I closed my eyes, tears burning. "But they're my family." Samuel's voice was low, steady. "Family isn't who shares your blood. Family is who shares your values. Right now, your true family are the people standing by you, the workers, the community, even us. Don't lose sight of that." I nodded, though the ache in my chest remained. The lawsuit dragged on. My father grew more frantic with each failed motion, my mother more manipulative with each interview, Uncle Stephen more venomous with each article. But Adam's arrest had shifted something. For the first time, the public began to see the truth not just in words, but in actions. The tide was turning, but the war wasn't over, because behind every attack, every lawsuit, every intrusion, I could feel something darker gathering. My father's pride was wounded. Stephen's greed was insatiable. Adam's anger was spiraling out of control. And I knew with cold certainty, the next strike wouldn't be in court or online. It would come here, to the ranch, to me. And when it did, I had to be ready, for the fight of my life. Adam's arrest should have been the breaking point, the moment when reason prevailed, when my father and Stephen realized their campaign of intimidation was collapsing. But instead, it only hardened them. 2 days after the incident at the barn, I received a thick envelope from my father's lawyers. Inside was a new petition. They were demanding an emergency hearing to challenge the validity of the trust itself. Their argument was absurd, that Grandpa and Grandma had been coerced into creating it, pressured by me, that I had isolated them in their final years. It was laughable in its desperation, but dangerous nonetheless. Courts take such accusations seriously. Harris came to the ranch immediately, briefcase in hand, his jaw set. "They're playing their last card," he said grimly. "If they can't break the will, they'll try to dismantle the trust. We'll fight it, of course. But be prepared, this is going to get uglier." I exhaled slowly. "How much uglier can it get?" He looked me dead in the eyes. "They'll try to paint you as a manipulator, a greedy veteran with PTSD who preyed on his grandparents' emotions. They'll drag your military service into this, your personal life, everything." The words stung, but I knew he was right. Already I'd seen whispers online, claims that I was unstable, paranoid, a control freak hiding behind lawyers. I could trace the origin of those whispers easily: Adam's friends, my father's associates, Stephen's overseas contacts. They were laying the groundwork to destroy my character. That night I sat alone in the study, staring at the evidence Samuel had given me. The photographs, the recordings, the diary. I had enough to bury them forever in the court of public opinion. Proof of lies, theft, betrayal. But using it would mean war without return. If I unleashed it all, there would be no reconciliation possible. Not now, not ever. As if sensing my turmoil, Samuel appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of tea. "Still awake, Mr. Daniel?" I nodded. "How do you fight your own blood, Samuel? How do you keep going when every step forward feels like burning another bridge?" He sat across from me, his gaze steady. "Your grandparents once asked me the same question. They saw what Richard and Stephen were becoming long before you did. They tried to correct them, to give them chances. But in the end, they understood that blood doesn't absolve greed. You don't fight them because you want to. You fight them because you have to, for the legacy, for the people who depend on you, and for the memory of the only family who truly loved you." His words hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just defending money. I was defending truth. And truth, once buried, had a way of poisoning everything around it. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the days leading up to it, the ranch became a hive of preparation. Harris worked day and night, compiling evidence, filing motions, rehearsing arguments. Mike and the security team doubled their shifts after reports surfaced of strangers loitering near the property line. And I threw myself into work, meeting with Silverline employees, checking on foundation projects, reminding myself why I was enduring all of this. But just when I thought things couldn't get more chaotic, a letter arrived. Not from lawyers, not from journalists, from my mother. Her handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. "Daniel, I don't know how much longer I can do this. Your father is obsessed, Adam is reckless, and Stephen is feeding the fire. I know we've hurt you, but please find a way to end this. Not for us, but for me. I can't bear to see my family destroyed." I read it 3 times, my hands trembling. Was it genuine remorse, or another attempt to manipulate me? I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that somewhere in her heart, my mother still cared more about love than money. But the necklace she had stolen after the funeral, the lies she had told in interviews, lingered in my memory. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the diary. Proof, either way. The day of the hearing arrived like the calm before a storm. The courthouse was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as I walked inside, flanked by Harris and Judge Harold. My father was already there, his suit immaculate, his expression a mask of righteous fury. Adam sat beside him, sneering openly at me. Uncle Stephen had flown in from London for the occasion, his smirk one of quiet confidence, as if he already believed he had won. My mother sat a few rows back, her eyes red, avoiding mine. The arguments began. Their lawyers painted me as a manipulator, citing my frequent visits to the ranch, my close relationship with my grandparents. They twisted my devotion into obsession, my loyalty into exploitation. They claimed my grandparents had been pressured into creating the trust, isolated from their true heirs. Then Harris stood, calm, deliberate. He laid out the medical evaluations, the witness testimonies, the trust's detailed clauses. He played clips from the video of my grandparents, their voices steady, declaring their decision clear. And finally, he introduced Samuel. The courtroom hushed as Samuel took the stand. His voice was calm, but heavy with truth. "I served this family for over 30 years. I watched Mr. Henry and Mrs. Evelyn build everything with their own hands. They loved their children, but they were not blind. They knew Richard and Stephen only saw money. They knew Adam had learned the same. That is why they prepared this trust. To protect Daniel, yes, but more importantly, to protect the legacy from being destroyed." His words landed like thunder. Even the judge leaned forward, listening intently. When it was my turn, I rose, my heart pounding. I spoke not as a lawyer, not as a strategist, but as a grandson. I didn't ask for this. I never begged for money, never demanded more than their time. They gave me this legacy because they trusted me, not because I was perfect, but because I loved them without condition. If honoring their wishes makes me the villain in my family's eyes, then so be it. I'll carry that burden, but I will not betray them. Silence followed. Then the judge cleared his throat. "The evidence is overwhelming. The trust stands. The will stands. This case is dismissed." My father erupted, slamming his fist on the table. Adam cursed loudly, his voice echoing through the chamber. Stephen muttered something under his breath, his composure finally cracking. My mother buried her face in her hands. I walked out of that courthouse to a blinding storm of cameras, my heart pounding, my chest heaving. I had won, again, but the victory felt hollow, because in that courtroom, I hadn't just defeated my family, I had lost them completely. That night, back at the ranch, I sat beneath the oak tree, staring at the stars. The air was cool, the land quiet, but inside I felt only exhaustion. They won't stop, I whispered to the graves. Not until they've destroyed me or themselves. And deep down I knew the worst was yet to come. Because people who have lost everything don't walk away quietly. They fight harder, dirtier, desperate. And my family was nothing if not desperate. The courthouse victory should have ended it. The trust was upheld, the will declared valid beyond challenge. On paper, the matter was finished. But my family didn't live on paper. They lived on resentment, obsession, and desperation. And desperation, I was learning, was like fire. It didn't smolder quietly, it spread. For a brief week, the ranch was calm. I buried myself in work, focusing on the foundation my grandparents had dreamed of. We held our first scholarship ceremony in the barn, awarding grants to 20 local students. Their eyes shone with hope as they held their certificates. One girl whispered to me, "Thank you, Mr. Moore. Now I can be the first in my family to go to college." For a fleeting moment, I felt peace. I could almost hear Grandma's voice in the rustle of the leaves outside. "Education is the key, Daniel. Give it freely and you'll change lives." But peace never lasted long. The next storm hit in the form of tabloids. Adam, somehow out on bail, had given an exclusive interview. The front page blared, "Brother stole our legacy." In the photos, he looked gaunt, his eyes sunken, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. He told wild stories of me locking him out of the family ranch, of me brainwashing our grandparents. He even accused me of threatening him with violence, a lie so bold it would have been laughable, if not for the way it spread like wildfire online. Messages poured into my inbox. Some supportive, but many filled with venom. "Greedy snake. Rotten hell thief. How could you do this to your own parents?" I felt the weight of it, each word like a stone pressing against my chest. But worse was the phone call I received 2 nights later. It was past midnight. The ranch was silent except for the chirping of crickets. My phone buzzed, an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Daniel." It was my mother's voice, raw, broken. "Please help us." I froze. "Mom? Your father, he's lost everything. The company is gone. The house is gone. He borrowed from the wrong people, Daniel. Dangerous people. They want their money, and we don't have it." Her voice cracked into sobs. "They said they'll hurt us. Please, son, I'm begging you. Just a little money to make them go away." My stomach twisted. Was this real, or just another ploy? I wanted to believe her desperation was genuine. I wanted to believe she cared more about survival than greed now. But my mind replayed every lie, every theft, every betrayal. "I can't," I whispered, my throat tight. "The trust doesn't allow it. You know that." "Damn the trust!" she screamed suddenly, her voice sharp as glass. "You hide behind it like a coward. You'd let your own family die for the sake of paperwork?" Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there in the dark, my hands shaking, my mind spiraling. If what she said was true, then my father's debts weren't just numbers on a ledger. They were threats with fists, guns, maybe worse. And if those men came looking for repayment, they wouldn't come knocking politely at the front door. The next day, Mike confirmed my worst fears. "We've picked up chatter," he said, his face grim. "Some local enforcers linked to loan sharks have been sniffing around Dallas, asking about your father, asking about you." The realization hit me like ice water. My father's ruin wasn't just his problem anymore. He had dragged me into it, dragged the ranch, the foundation, everything into the crosshairs of criminals. That evening, I gathered my council again. Harris, Samuel, Mike. "We can't ignore this," Mike said bluntly. "If loan sharks think they can pressure you through your father, they'll come here. They'll see this ranch as a treasure chest waiting to be cracked open." Harris adjusted his glasses. "Legally, we're sound. But legality doesn't matter to men with baseball bats. You'll need to prepare for more than lawsuits now." Samuel's voice was heavy. "Mr. Daniel, your grandparents feared this. That's why they tied the assets into the trust. They knew Richard's recklessness would invite danger, but they also trusted that you wouldn't bend. Don't bend now." I looked at them, my chest tight, my heart heavy. "So what do I do? Let them suffer? Let those people tear them apart?" No one answered. That night, unable to sleep, I walked the perimeter of the ranch alone. The night air was cool, the stars sharp against the Texas sky. I stopped at the oak tree, resting a hand on the cold stone of my grandparents' grave. "What would you do?" I whispered. "Would you help them, even after everything, or would you let them drown in their own choices?" The wind answered with a low moan through the branches, but no words, no clarity. Days passed, each heavier than the last. Reports trickled in. My father had vanished from Dallas. Adam was spiraling deeper into drugs and alcohol. Stephen had retreated to England but continued to hurl venom from afar. My mother called again, sometimes begging, sometimes raging, always desperate. And then one morning, the storm broke for real. Mike burst into the study, his face pale. "We've got movement. 4 SUVs just pulled up at the outer gate. Men inside, not your family. Armed." My blood turned to ice. "Loan sharks?" He nodded. "Looks like it. They're here for money. Or blood." Alarms blared through the ranch as my security team mobilized. I ran to the monitors, my heart hammering. The SUVs idled at the gate, engines rumbling, men stepping out with heavy jackets that couldn't quite hide the bulges underneath. One of them shouted, his voice carrying across the fields, "More! You owe money. You pay today. Or someone pays in blood." I stood frozen, staring at the screen, every muscle in my body taut with fear and fury. This was it. The fight had come to my doorstep. And I realized, with chilling certainty, that my family's war over the inheritance had spilled into something far darker, far deadlier than I ever imagined. The question now wasn't whether I could protect the legacy. It was whether I could survive protecting it. The engines of those 4 SUVs roared like a war drum at the gate, and the sight of armed men spilling out made the air around me heavy, almost unbreathable. This wasn't family anymore. This wasn't legal skirmishes or social media slander. This was raw violence knocking at my door. I gripped the edge of the desk in my study, staring at the live feed from the monitors. The floodlights illuminated them clearly. Hard faces, cold eyes, movements sharp and coordinated. These weren't petty criminals. They were professionals. My father's debts had attracted predators, and they had followed the blood trail straight to me. Mike's voice crackled through the radio clipped to my belt. "Boss, we've got them locked outside for now. Your call. Want us to engage?" My throat was dry. "Hold position. Don't fire unless they breach. Sheriff Ramirez?" "I'm already rolling," the sheriff replied over the line. "But we're 20 minutes out. You've got to hold them until then." 20 minutes. Against men who looked like they had nothing to lose. I took a deep breath and strode out of the study. Samuel trailing behind me. His old hands trembled, but his eyes were fierce. "They'll try to break you with fear, Mr. Daniel. Don't let them see it." We stepped onto the porch, and I could hear their voices now, carrying over the fields. "More? You think you're untouchable? Your old man owes us 600 grand, 6 months overdue. We're collecting, one way or another." One of them raised a baseball bat and slammed it against the metal gate. The clang echoed through the night. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted back, my voice shaking but loud. "This ranch isn't your battlefield. You want money? You'll find nothing here but law and steel. Leave before you make a mistake you can't take back." They laughed, the kind of laugh that chilled you because it held no warmth, no humanity. "You've got millions in there, boy. Don't play games. Open up, or we'll drag you out." Behind me, Samuel whispered, "Your father did this. He pulled you into their pit." And I realized the cruel truth. The men at the gate weren't just here for repayment. They were here because my father had told them. He had pointed them to me, hoping they'd scare me into paying, into breaking the trust, into surrendering. My own father had unleashed wolves on me. The next few minutes were chaos. They tried to ram the gate with one of the SUVs, the metal groaning under the impact but holding steady. My security team activated the second perimeter. Motion sensors blared, floodlights flared brighter, alarms screamed across the property. Armed guards took positions, rifles leveled. Mike's voice was a calm anchor in the storm. "Hold. Wait. If they breach, we push back." One of the men lit a Molotov cocktail, fire flickering against the night, and hurled it toward the gate. It shattered, flames licking at the gravel. My chest seized with rage. This was my grandparents' land, sacred ground, and they dared defile it. "Sheriff's 5 minutes out," came the crackle over the radio. The men outside grew more desperate, pounding, shouting, threatening. "Last chance, more. We'll come through, and when we do, you'll wish you'd paid." I stood on the porch, fists clenched, staring at the burning gate. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Fear coursed through me, yes, but under it was something stronger: resolve. When the sirens finally cut through the night, wailing louder than the chaos, the men hesitated. Their laughter died, their movements faltered. One by one, they scrambled back into the SUVs. Tires screeched, engines roared, and within moments they were gone, vanishing into the dark. The sheriff's cruisers rolled up seconds later, lights flashing red and blue. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, but the intruders had already fled. Ramirez strode up the porch, his face grim. "You okay?" I nodded, though my hands still shook. "For now." He looked at the scorched gate, the broken glass, the scorch marks on the gravel. "This isn't over, Daniel. They'll be back. Loan sharks don't just walk away empty-handed, especially not from six figures." Samuel placed a hand on my shoulder. "Then we'll be ready." That night, the ranch felt like a war zone. The air smelled of smoke, the silence broken by the hum of patrol vehicles. I walked the halls, unable to sleep, my thoughts spiraling. My father had dragged this violence here. He had put me, Samuel, my workers, everyone at risk just to escape the consequences of his own greed. And that was when it hit me with brutal clarity. I wasn't just protecting money anymore. I was protecting lives. My family's recklessness had summoned darkness, and now it was my duty to shield everyone my grandparents had cared for, from employees to neighbors to the very community this ranch anchored. The next morning I called Harris and made my decision. File charges, not just for the inheritance battle, for everything: fraud, theft, conspiracy. If my father wants war, then let it be total war. He brought wolves to my door. I won't forgive that. Harris's voice was quiet, resolute. "It will be messy, painful, but it will end." I hung up and looked out over the fields. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the land. For the first time, I didn't just feel like an heir. I felt like a soldier again, standing at the edge of a battlefield, ready to fight not just for survival, but for something greater. My grandparents had trusted me with this legacy, and I swore on their graves that I would protect it. Even if it meant burning every last bridge of blood that tied me to the people who had once called themselves my family. Because this war was no longer about inheritance. It was about justice. And justice, I decided, would come, no matter the cost. The morning after the attack, the ranch looked both wounded and defiant. The scorched marks near the gate, the shattered glass on the gravel, and the acrid smell of smoke in the air were reminders of how close the enemy had come. But the ranch still stood. The house still stood. And so did I. I walked through the fields at sunrise, boots crunching in the dew-soaked grass. Every corner of this land carried memories of my grandparents. Grandpa showing me how to steer the tractor, Grandma humming while hanging laundry in the wind, both of them laughing together at the dinner table. This was what I was fighting for. Not the millions in the trust, not the company shares, but the soul of this place, the proof that integrity could outlast greed. That day, Harris filed the charges I had demanded: fraud, theft, conspiracy. He compiled everything: the financial records, the diary entries, the security footage, even the footage from the night Adam tried to break into the barn. He built a case not just to defend me, but to expose them. "We're no longer reacting, Daniel," he said firmly over the phone. "From here on out, we strike first." The media swarmed when the news broke. Headlines screamed across Texas and beyond. More patriarchs sued by own son. Inheritance battle erupts into criminal charges. Loan sharks target family fortune. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, chasing me for statements. I gave only one: this is not about money. It's about honoring the truth my grandparents lived by. I will not let greed destroy their legacy. Public opinion began to swing hard. The footage of armed men at the ranch, released by Sheriff Ramirez's office, went viral. People saw the truth with their own eyes. This wasn't a story of inheritance jealousy anymore. It was a story of survival against corruption. Strangers sent letters of support, donations poured into the foundation, and Silverline Logistics employees rallied around me like a shield. But my family responded with fury. My father called, his voice like broken glass. "You'll regret this, Daniel. You think you can ruin me? You're destroying your own blood." "You destroyed yourself," I answered, my tone steady, even as my heart ached. "I'm just refusing to let you drag me down with you." Adam sent me a text that same night. I hope you rot alone on that ranch. You'll never be part of this family again." And Uncle Stephen from England released a public statement calling me a power-hungry tyrant who weaponized grief to steal everything. But his words rang hollow now. Too many people had seen the truth. Weeks turned into months. The legal machine ground forward, slow but relentless. My father's debts came into the open. His company collapsed, lawsuits piled up, his allies abandoned him. Adam faced charges of fraud and theft. Stephen, protected by distance, tried to save face but found himself irrelevant in the unfolding storm. Through it all, the ranch grew stronger. The foundation expanded, offering scholarships, supporting veterans, helping local families. Silverline Logistics flourished under honest management, its reputation rebuilt from the ground up. And my security company thrived, not just because of contracts, but because clients trusted a man who had proven he would never compromise on protection. One evening, 6 months after the attack, we held a community gathering at the ranch. The barns were strung with lights, tables filled with food, children running across the fields with laughter that echoed into the night. Neighbors, employees, veterans, students, all of them together, celebrating not just what had been saved, but what had been built. As I stood at the center, Samuel by my side, Harris raising a glass, and Mike keeping a watchful eye from the edge, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. When the speeches ended, I slipped away quietly to the oak tree where my grandparents rested. The night was calm, the stars bright above. I knelt by the gravestones, tracing their names with my fingers. "I did it," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Not perfectly, not without scars, but I kept my promise. I protected it. I protected everything." Tears fell freely, soaking into the earth. I lost them. Mom, Dad, Adam, Stephen. They're gone from me now, maybe forever. But I kept you. I kept your lessons, your values, and I'll carry them until my last breath. The wind stirred through the branches, gentle, almost like a hand brushing my shoulder. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. As I walked back toward the glow of the gathering, I realized the truth my grandparents had known all along. Family is not just blood. Family is those who share your values, who stand beside you when the world turns hostile, who build with you instead of tearing down. My old life had ended with that plane crash. My new life had been forged in fire, lawsuits, betrayal, threats, violence. But from the ashes, something stronger had risen. A legacy not of money, but of resilience. I was Daniel Moore, heir to Silverline Logistics, defender of my grandparents' honor, protector of a community that now called me their own. And though I had lost my blood family, I had gained something far greater, a true family built on trust, loyalty, and love. As the night air filled with laughter and music behind me, I raised my glass to the stars. To you, Grandpa. To you, Grandma. Your whispers didn't fade, they became my voice, and through me, they'll echo forever. The war was over, the legacy endured,